Good morning. Um, as you can see, I'm recording from the office this morning. Well, you probably don't know that just by looking at the background, but I don't have my normal uh, electronic background in play here today because I am on campus. But anyway, this morning I want to take a little bit of time and talk to you about Walt Whitman in particular. And in particular, a little bit about Song of Myself, a little bit about When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed. And it is not by coincidence that I'm wearing a Notorious B.I.G. shirt. And wore it specifically for this video. But I'll get to that. The connection or I won't say connection, but parallel between Notorious B.I.G. and Walt Whitman, which I'll get to that as we move on here for the next few minutes. Um, and I apologize for the lighting. The lighting in my office is less than ideal. Um, so we can look, I could screen share, but I'll just start by talking a little bit about um, Song of Myself. I mean, if you and Leaves of Grass in general, if you have watched or you know read about Walt Whitman, if you've watched the documentary, and admittedly, the documentary I include in the week two folder is 3 hours long. It's a little bit of a time commitment. Honestly, I would recommend you know listening to, but putting it on YouTube on your phone yeah, and listening to it on your way to work or something like that. Same thing with Song of Myself. It is a quite a long poem, and it basically in its final form, it took Whitman around about 40 years, right, to get it to its final form. And of course, he probably would have tweaked it some more, but he, of course, passes away in 1891 or 1892. The deathbed edition, which I've included in your folder for week two under Whitman, is the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass, the 1891 Leaves of Grass. In it, you can find all the poems that are referenced in the folder. You can also find, of course, Whitman's other work, and so much of his work is influential and arguably moving. Namely, which I did not include the poem, but namely Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, um, uh, Dalliance of Eagles is a poem that Harold Bloom mentions. If you look at the Harold Bloom lecture on Whitman, I can kind of break that down for you a little bit so that kind of give you the high points of that Bloom's lecture as we um, move forward with this. But I do want to mention, like I said, so Song of Myself, the ideas, it's somewhat monistic in its character, meaning that for Whitman, ultimately, there's not much of a difference between there's little difference between nature, the self, the individual self, and the divine, right? Or for that matter, other people. There's somewhat of a difference, but it's it's subtle, right? So Whitman ultimately sees himself as interconnected with nature, interconnected with other human beings, interconnected with, uh, as we'll see in When Lilacs Last and Dorier Bloom, connected with uh, creatures, right, of nature. Um, which he refers to as brother, right? So, so that's really an important factor in look in Song of Myself, really, and also the grand democratizing, right, of of poetry and the poetic pursuit. Um, you know, Whitman invites the reader. He's trying to essentially initiate the reader into um, creating the reader's own version of the song of themselves, right? Um, and to do this, Whitman says that he sounds his barbaric yelp, right? In other words, you don't, it doesn't have to be a thing of finesse, right? It just has to be a thing that is representative of, as Keats would say, the beauty or truth, right? It has to be representative of truth and the truth of the self. Now, for a long time, like if you look at Whitman's lines, they're just expansive, right? They're just, and for a long time, and I mean like, 80 some years, or more, right? People looked at that and well, there's no rhyme or reason to it. What is his poetic form? Where is this coming from? Until some folks happened upon, realized, I mean, it was essentially in everybody's face, as it were. It's kind of there. But what he's doing is he's drawing upon the cadences of the King James Bible, right? That and again, this is a very democratizing, uh, uh, deliberate act, right? Because, and the reason why I say it's democratizing is because in the 19th century, right, in America, if there were one book in the house, it was going to be the King James Bible. If there were two books in the house, it was going to be the King James Bible and the complete works of Shakespeare, right? So, um, most folks, you know, the vast majority of Whitman's readers, if not all of Whitman's initial readers, would have been familiar with King James, and and so this would be something, the cadences, right, the rhythms would be something that would resonate with them. Now, that is not to say that Whitman is making a Christian or Judeo-Christian theological statement with all of this, but that he's drawing upon the rhythms and the cadences of the tradition, that the oral tradition that comes out of the King James Bible, which isn't in and of itself is a remarkable document, despite its translation problems. As an artifact and as a work of art, it's brilliant. And it arguably has had more influence on um, English verse and in prose in the English language than just about any other document. But it certainly influenced Whitman, and Whitman grew up a Quaker, so he would have been familiar, right, with um, that text, and really in the notion of self, right, the notion of self um, becomes very prominent, even if one does not um, equate the self the way Whitman does, right? The notion of self in America. Of course, if you watch the documentary, you know that America was the great concern of Whitman. Whitman saw America as uh, the potential to be something just incredible, and he was and of course, he says in Song of Myself, he contains the multitudes because oftentimes he's very contradictory, right? On the one hand, he ardently supports the idea of manifest destiny, that that America is supposed to stretch from one coast to the other, and indeed, in Manifest Destiny, originally it was supposed to go up into Canada and then down into Mexico. right? Um, so he supports this, and then on the other hand, he is very he shows a lot of deference, a lot of respect in his poems to Native Americans. And so there's that. There's also in his poems the um, an almost ambivalence to the acknowledgement that he sees himself at one with everyone in some sense, and that includes both the slave and the slave master. So how does he reconcile that? Well, he doesn't necessarily arguably, but again, he gives himself an out saying, well, I contain the multitudes. Of course, I'm contradictory, right? And then, of course, most controversial um, in Whitman's own lifetime would have been the erotic nature of a lot of the poems, like a lot of the stanzas. The very famous stanza about the bather, right? The woman who sneaks in and bathes um, in the nude, right, with a bunch of with men, and the men are not aware that she's there, and she sneaks in and bathes with them, right? This was, I mean, Whitman was um, infamously fired from his job at the Department of the Interior because his boss found a copy of, as Harold Bloom points out, and as the documentary points out too, found a copy of his book in his desk, found a copy of one of the earlier editions of Leaps of Grass in his desk, and was like, this is essentially pornographic. We don't want this guy, so he's fired. Uh, Perhaps unfairly, because I mean he did a lot during the war, to for as a nurse and so forth, and so, but anyway, um and of course a lot of the eroticism in Leaves of Grass in total is homoerotic, because Whitman without question was what we would refer to now as gay, although um homosexuality as an identity, it's important to understand that homosexuality as an identity really doesn't take shape until the 20th century. Um, Before that, sexuality was something you did, right? So if you had male partners, you had male partners. If you had female partners, you had female partners, or both, right? And oftentimes in Victorian society, especially, a lot of men's first experience was with other men, because you had the quote unquote virgin whore dichotomy with women, meaning that you were either you were either virginal and chaste, or you were a quote unquote whore. And so, um, for men to experiment sexually, they either did it with each other or they did it with quote unquote whores, right? So, um, you know, and of course, the famous statement by Queen Victoria, um, uh, to women regarding sexuality was, lie back and think of England, right? So women were not supposed to enjoy sexuality. Um, and we Americans tend to take things very, very ardently seriously, because um, regardless of one's theological background, if one is raised in America, ultimately one has Calvinism sort of permeating through one's being, because so much of American culture is Calvinist. And not the sort of Calvinist light that the current Presbyterian Church uh, focuses on. God has a plan for your life, etc. I'm talking about the Calvinism where weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth kind of kind of thing. And within that prosperity gospel and all these things, right? The idea that if you um uh are not wealthy, if you have some kind of physical ailment, blah 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 blah, right? Then God must first of all, God can damn whomever God wants to, regardless of whether you're a good bad person or whatever, or your own beliefs or your own devotion, whatever, it doesn't matter. God can damn whoever God wants to. But if you have wealth, etc., and so on, probably God's favoring you, right? That's the whole, um, um, Calvinism as it has come through by way of, and more recently, like Norman Vincent Peale, and you get into a lot of the televangelists and so on that uh but this is very American, and it's been with us since the very beginning. I'm talking about before the revolution. I mean, before the American Revolution, right? I mean, it's very much American, and so this is something that but in Whitman's time, um, in the Victorian and Edwardian period and so forth, and in America, I mean, but when that stuff was sort of becoming passé in Great Britain, we were holding on to it firmly in America, right, for a long time. Uh, as a professor of mine said, when he was younger, he went to on a trip to the Vatican, and he was this is an example of what I'm talking about. So my professor grew up Catholic, which is not Calvinist by way of theology. However, he went to the Vatican. He and his group of Americans went to the Vatican, and they actually got to meet Pope John the 23rd and the whole bit and everything. And it was Friday, and this is pre-Vatican II, right? So they were like, oh no, we've we don't have anything to eat. What are we going to eat? We don't, because pre-Vatican II, you didn't eat meat on Fridays, right? So the bishops or cardinals or whomever were there just started laughing, and they said, you Americans, they said, we make the rules, you keep them, right? So, right. So, my point being is that, um, as so Whitman's version of the self and Whitman's call in Song of Myself is contrary to this, right? He's trying to break the Calvinist mold, if you will. Um, does he succeed in his own life, personal life? Probably. I mean, he does live more or less as what we would consider openly gay, although he doesn't really advertise, so to speak, but he does not deny it either. And he has one prominent lover in his life um over a period of time. Um, but he lives a very sort of his life is interior, right? His eroticism, if you will, is interior. Now you get to Ginsberg a couple of generations later, and he sort of enacts Song of Myself writ large, beginning in his own sort of proclamation of Howell and Kaddish and I argue Wichita Vortex Sutra. And so he in a sense is enacting Whitman. But um within Song of Myself, you really get um a working out, and Bloom kind of points this out. Uh, so Whitman is very influenced by um Ralph Waldo Emerson, who's really responsible for quote unquote American transcendentalism. Um, he does not, as Bloom says he invents transcendental. He does not invent transcendentalism. Transcendentalism comes from the concept of transcendentalism, comes from India, of course, comes from the Bhagavad Gita, uh, Upanishads, so forth. In fact, Emerson mistranslates some key terms from the Bhagavad Gita and so on. That's not to discount, Emerson's accomplishments. Uh, but anyway, so Whitman reads Emerson and is incredibly inspired by him. He calls Emerson the master, and so forth. In fact, one of the only sort of positive reviews early on that Whitman gets of one of the first editions of Leaves of Grass, I believe it's the second edition, could be wrong. But Emerson writes him a letter and tells him, how great the book is. So Whitman actually prints the letter. I believe he prints it in the second edition, I should say, and it's just how great the book is without Emerson's permission, right? So there is a connection there, but Whitman ultimately um, departs from Emersonian transcendentalism in the sense that for him the body is as sacred, right, as any other aspect of one's being, be it soul, be it, the body is sacred. He has the famous poem, "I sing the body electric," right? Um, and interestingly, the phrase "leaves of grass," which is of course the title of his let me pull this up because I'm gonna misquote it if I don't. The title of his collected works that he spends again like 40 years plus um working on. The phrase "leaves of grass" is, Harold Bloom argues, and I find it fairly compelling, is in reference to Isaiah, right? And it's actually from First Peter, and in First Peter, the author of First Peter is quoting because the author of First Peter is probably not Peter, right? Anyway, you take my world literature class and we talk about biblical exegesis. Anyway, but and redacted stuff and how text like something like the Bible comes together. But anyway, and again, textual scholarship and faith are two different things, right? So I'm not encroaching upon anyone's faith. I'm just talking about the evidence of text and what have you, right? Actually, I think First Peter might be actually attributed to Peter, whereas Second Peter is doubtful. Anyway, um, anyway, I digress. So Peter, the author of First Peter here, is quoting from Isaiah. He says, and this is from the New Revised Standard Oxford edition, right? All flesh is like grass, and all its glory like the flower of grass. The grass withers and the flower falls, but the word of the Lord endures forever, right? So all flesh is like grass. That is essentially what Whitman is saying there, is that all flesh is sacred. And whereas Isaiah says, and Peter by way of Isaiah is saying, the word of the Lord endures forever, Whitman would say, the self, the voice of the self would endure forever, right? Um, be that the universal self that every person is somehow connected to or a part of, be that the individual self and so forth. That's what's important for Whitman. So when you look at Whitman, when you look at Song of Myself, think about that. Think about those ideas. Also, um, the central event for Whitman is the Civil War, as it was for um, uh, anybody, right, alive at that time, right, in America, right. So part of the revision of Song of Myself and of Leaves of Grass in general that goes on is more incorporation of references to and poems about the Civil War. So, for example, I included the wound dresser, right? That is um, that is a piece about literally, Whitman as a nurse, as a battlefield nurse, right? Or well, he wasn't a battlefield nurse. He was a essentially because like we don't really have the concept of the way battles were fought back then. Like literally, they were fighting a battle, outside of the city of Washington, right, or near the city of Washington. They would bring the wounded into Washington, and Whitman would Whitman was among those who would tend to the wounded. So, Wound Dresser is about that, and it's about the awe and reverence and camaraderie that Whitman feels for this injured soldier. And there's some eroticism there. Um, the performance that I have of it there is a part of um, a play, um, and I actually include the whole play there if you want to watch, if you want to see it, because it's a really well done performance. It mixes the poetry of Whitman and the poetry of Tom Gunn. The idea is equating Whitman's experiences in the Civil War with Gunn's experiences in the AIDS crisis, right, of the 80s to a to essentially the isolation and unknown of the pandemic. And so and sort of played together as on stage. It's a one-man show played together as basically this soldier's experience, right? So it's interesting. You don't have to watch it, right? But it's there if you want to look at it. Um, so moving on to um, well, almost not quite. So there is in Whitman, particularly in Song of Myself and Democratic Vistas and other pieces, right? There is a fervor, a religiosity, if you will. I mean, he is sort of an evangelist for this idea of the potential greatness, right, of America and what that could mean. Um, and in that context, he has a lot in common with really, I mean, frankly, with fundamentalists. Uh, so, again, in the Harold Bloom lecture that I included, Bloom talks about how he traveled all throughout the South and the Midwest um, uh, in the 1980s, uh, late 1980s, early 90s, visiting churches. And what because he didn't, he was trying to grasp why it is that people vote against their own economic interests, right? Um, Vote for folks who um, don't necessarily think of put the working class at the forefront. Now, arguably, does any politician really do that? You know, but anyway, this was Bloom's question, right? This is Bloom's thought, and because to in Bloom's in Bloom's thinking, not necessarily Bloom as a person, but just in a sort of academia at large, or I should say one sort of phrase that resonates in academia or has in the past is Marx's religion is the opium of the masses, right? So what Bloom says is actually for millions of Americans, people who identify as fundamentalists, people who, and so forth, religion is not the opiate of the masses. Religion is the poetry of the masses, right? And so in Song Myself, Whitman is trying to express a poetry of the masses in that sense. And for, according to Bloom, the the fundamentalist perspective, the Jesus that the fundamentalists uh, gravitate towards is not the Jesus of the Passion, right? Isn't even really the Jesus of the Beatitudes. It's the Jesus of the 40 days after the resurrection when he is with the disciples. And he said, Bloom says, and this is Harold Bloom. It's, I mean, feel free to argue with Harold Bloom for one, he's dead. But anyway, Bloom says that for a great many fundamentalists, it's as if Jesus never ascended, right? In the narrative, right? Jesus ascends, but it's as if Jesus never ascends. That for for the fundamentalists, it's that Jesus is right there, that Jesus has a relationship with that with an individual that is essentially inscrutable, and the only person capable of really understanding the self with a capital S of that individual, right, would be Jesus. And so it's like Jesus and the person, right? And so in that working out of that dynamic, that becomes in all of the texts involved and all of whatever involved, that becomes the poetry of the masses, of that masses of millions, rather than the opiate. I think that's an interesting distinction. And I think that Whitman, speaking um, in what he calls the self, like that's what he's drawing on. He's not drawing, I mean, he's not arguing for a footprints poster kind of view of the self, or view of humanity and divinity, etc. But he's arguing for a huge uh democratic expression of the self that can become, he wants um, Leaves of Grass to become, right, the poetry of the masses, right? And in one sense, it has, right, because it influences so many people. In fact, in the 1973 book, incredibly influential book, The Anxiety of Influence, right? Harold Bloom, again, he was an incredible critic, artist, blah 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 blah. Um, died about 10 years ago. But he argues that the influence of one artist on another is very much like the relationship between a parent and a child. In other words, there's a lot of anxiety there, right? Anybody who, if you remember back to your teenage years, or anybody who has a teenager, right, or is around teenagers, right, there's a lot of anxiety there. On the one hand, there's a great deal of respect, for what's been taught and what's been handed down. On the other hand, there's a pull. I want to do this on my own. I want to do this my way, right? And so with artists and so forth, it's very much Bloom argues it's the same. There's a tension there, right? So if you look at a couple of some of the poems that I've included, The Pact, for example, Ezra in this folder, the Whitman folder, with Ezra Pound, he's really trying to come to a resolution, right? He's saying, Whitman, I've agonized over you long enough. Let's come to I want to chill. I want peace here. I want to do but want to be free to do my own thing. Um um and those of us who are a little older, I turned 50 in a few months, right? I can tell you my father's been deceased for over 10 years. I didn't speak to him in my 20s, okay, but in my 30s, I became we developed a relationship as adults, right? And it became very meaningful. I'm not advocating not speaking to one's parents for 10, 15 years, but that's just what happened in my life. And so the idea, so with the artist, it's very similar that you have this tension, and the artist is creating their work, working on their work, and then ultimately they get to a point where they can essentially survive, exist on their own creatively, and so they make peace with those who have come before, right? You see the same thing in a different expression, right? With with a supermarket from California, right? And supermarket from California, Ginsberg in a very Ginsberg fashion has Whitman and Garcia Lorca like in a supermarket, and Whitman's like checking out the stock boys, looking at, and so on and so forth, right? But you know, um, it's still, Whitman's there, right? Arguably, Ginsburg achieves the resolution of that tension, right? That looking towards a father. Like for Ginsburg, he really has two fathers poetically, right? He's got Whitman and William Carlos Williams. We'll get to that later. But anyway, uh, he reaches that resolution, he accomplishes that resolution in Wichita Vortex Suture, right? Which is his essentially version of democratic vistas in the wake of the Vietnam War as opposed to the American Civil War. Um, but we'll get to that eventually. But when lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed, I wanted to talk about that, and I realized that I've been talking for who knows how long at this point. Feel free to fast forward through however much of my videos you want to fast forward through, honestly. But when lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed is significant because it is an elegy to Abraham Lincoln, and Abraham Lincoln is the person in whom Whitman saw the hope, right, for America. He it's about as close to messianic as Whitman gets, right? He The fact that, historically, um through lots of horrible bloodshed and so on and so forth, Lincoln was able to um sustain the Union. Um for Whitman, that's pretty sacred because for Whitman, America is sacred. America's sacred to Whitman almost the way that America is sacred to Mormons, for example, right? Everybody knows in Mormon theology, the Garden of Eden is in fact in Missouri. And I'm not arguing for or against that. That's just a statement, right? Um, but so but Whitman would champion that idea, right? Whitman be like, sure, why wouldn't the Garden of Eden be in Missouri? You know? So so the thing, and if you go to the Abraham Lincoln Museum, and I've been there, right? Y with even in the North, I mean, you would of course expect um, newspapers from the South and so on and so forth to rail against Lincoln. Newspapers in the North railed against Lincoln. Oh yeah, the war was not popular when it was going because for the long for quite a while, it was very uncertain which side was gonna come out victorious, and there were a lot of lives lost and so forth, and it all sort of landed on the head shoulders, if you will, of Abraham Lincoln. Whitman was unmoved, right? Whitman was always in support of Lincoln. In fact, when Lincoln would come, they didn't know each other personally, but Lincoln would come along and his coach every day or every evening, and Whitman would bow to him, right? So and and yeah, this the lighting in here just leaves a lot to be desired. Um, so in any case, the what's going on in the poem is it's the funeral procession for Lincoln, and most of you are aware that when a president is assassinated, basically their body goes from Washington, sits in state in Washington, it goes all throughout the country until it reaches the destination. So in the case of Lincoln, it was Springfield, Illinois, right? So this is a poem about that funeral procession, and Whitman talks about going into a farm, the front of a farmyard, and pulling up, breaking a sprig of lilac, and he's gonna and he tosses it on the coffin, right? And what's significant about lilac, Whitman describes it in the poem, is that the lilac leaves are heart shaped, right? And so he's really, and it's unabashedly like loves Abraham Lincoln, and so this is about that, and he's so full of grief, and he feels like he hasn't really been allowed to release that grief. Well, he hears a thrush, which it's again very very much a democratization of songbirds, right, or birds, because when you think about poetry and birds, traditionally you don't really you think about nightingale, for example. You don't necessarily think about thrush, but Whitman here in this poem is a thrush, and so he's talking to the thrush, and he says you're able to express yourself, you're able to cry for the fallen, right? He says, I want to do that, right? And so through the course of the poem, what's happening is Whitman is expressing his grief. And ultimately, by the end of the poem, what you have is you have Whitman's sort of cathartic, you have his release, his acceptance that, um, um, Lincoln is going to be interred, and so forth. But and throughout the poem, death in and of itself is um, not negative, right? It's a very quote unquote romantic with a capital R notion of death. He refer Death is actually in the poem is feminine, right? So basically, Lincoln is going into the essentially into the embrace um, of something that is of a state that is nurturing and protective, from Whitman's point of view. Um, you know, it's it's a beautiful poem. Um, Listen to it a couple of times, read it. Um, Disagree with me if you want, please. Uh, you know, interestingly, um, the community, the back and forth with Whitman and the bird never doesn't respond to Whitman, but the idea, but Whitman looking at the bird, as his brother, as his friend, right? It reminds me of the Katha Upanishad as well as the Bhagavad Gita, where the soul, the self, is depicted as two birds on a tree, one being the individual person, right? And the other being God, right? Or and so one, the individual, the one that's the individual person is eating the fruits of the tree, right? Is obsessed with the fruits of the tree. And the idea is that uh release or happiness or joy or enlightenment, whatever you have, what have you, cannot be really achieved until the person turns away from the fruit and observes and looks at his friend, right? So it's not, and that's kind of a stretch, right, on my part. But the idea is that Whitman is not really able to express his grief and his joy, his tumults of emotions, right? Really, until he um acknowledges the thrush, right, and looks to the thrush, right? So that's kind of interesting. Now, why did I bring up Notorious B.I.G. at the beginning of this video? So, um, I argue that in in one sense, and when lilacs last and the dahlia bloomed, um, Whitman is in expressing his love for Lincoln, kind of trying to give Lincoln his last hurrah, if you will, in the sense of his his expression of love is invigorating, right? Lincoln in some sense, and he says at the end of the poem that when when he sees lilacs blooming from then on, he's going to think of Lincoln and or remember Lincoln, right? And when we talk about memory, what we're really talking about is we're talking about connecting, right? So the poem is a tether of vitality in a sense to Lincoln. So there's an interview, Valletta Wallace, uh, Christopher Wallace, aka Notorious B.I.G., right? His mother gave an interview where she said that when his funeral procession was passing through the Bedford-Stuyvesant area of Brooklyn, right, and past near Bedford-Stuyvesant and into that area of Brooklyn, um, somebody turned on the song "Hypnotize," right, and the entire community like just started like chanting the song, and everything it was, and she felt as if what the crowd was doing is they were temporarily, revitalizing, Biggie, even if, of course, he was dead. But it was there. It was the mass expenditure of energy and the mass chanting of this song in unison that they really were trying to bring Biggie back in that moment, right? And so, in the sense, to me, there's a parallel there, but with what's happening with Walt Whitman. Now you can't. It's so that it's parallel. There's not like really a direct line between Walt Whitman and hip hop. However, I mean, um, hip hop, like the poetry of Walt Whitman, is a democratic pursuit, right? The whole idea of hip hop was that, especially in New York, was that they defunded all the music programs, and the kids said, well, we're going to find a way to make music. So they took, disco records, and they figured out how to spin and extend the breaks in the songs, and then they ultimately they start rapping over the MC. I mean, if you know the history of hip hop, I'm not the best teller of it, but the emceeing came in later because the idea was the MC would shout out people, right? And the DJ was the one that started out the celebrity, but ultimately the MCs eclipsed that. But and that really comes from, you can draw a direct line from sort of the spinning in the part, uh the hip hop in the parks, but you can draw that from to James Brown, and then from James Brown to the African American churches, and through jazz, African American churches, and so on, blues, and so on. And eventually you get into this nebulous space where Whitman is also there, right? Because Whitman is experiencing the sights and sounds and so on that ultimately influence blues and jazz and so forth that are ultimately American. So anyway, um, that's my discussion on Walt Whitman, and I'm sure I'm leaving quite a bit out. But anyway, it is what it is, and I will talk to you soon.